Wow! Whilst being seated on my spinal tap cushion. Oh, and you probably will hear that's the trash van that is actually taking up the trash. Third video. I'm spamming, but I wanted to show you that over there. I got a case, a protective case for use on my Chameleon 64 Turbo Chameleon 64 setup, and this came from Canada a while ago, but I forgot to show it because I fell down the stairs. So yeah, I managed to put it on, and I'll just quickly show you what it looks like. And it actually looks like this. This part was exposed, and you can put a little. There's a little door. You can actually see there's all sorts of exposed parts. There's actually connectors for a Commodore 64 keyboard, an Amiga keyboard, and stuff. And this is a 3D printed case, which is slightly different than the yellow case of the Turbo Chameleon 64. And this is what it looks like without the case on, and yeah, there's a ton of pins exposed, which is not very nice. But it basically turns it into a very nice closed-off computer. Okay, so this is actually where I got the 3D printed case. I got it at corei64.com. If you search for Turbo 64 Chameleon dock case, you'll be able to find it. It's $28. You can get it in black, and you can get it in yellow. I think in yellow it looks best. It looks a lot nicer, and it also comes with an extra cover covering up that little hole that you see over here on the top. You can take that out if you want, for example, to hook up a C64 keyboard like so. Yeah, I prefer the yellow version, but some might prefer the black version, and I think this really makes it quite a difference to your Chameleon Turbo Chameleon 64 dock. So yeah, I'd recommend buying this. I mean, this is not a sponsored video. This is just my own opinion. So yeah, for you guys to go check it out if you have a Turbo Chameleon 64 dock. It's an FPGA system that actually is a Commodore 64 cartridge, but basically can actually function as a Commodore 64 itself. It has its own graphics output, and that's VGA. It has its own sound output, that's a jack plug, and it has a multifunctional connector for keyboard, mouse, but also the serial connector. So it basically functions as a complete Commodore 64, but it does more because it also does Amiga. It functions as a minimig FPGA, but it also does MSX, TurboGrafx 16. It's a great system. I've put up some other videos on it, and actually this somehow replaced my Amiga 1200 because that's still waiting for different caps. And it also replaces to some extent my new C64 re-release. It uses a new motherboard, and I just have it standing over here. I use those intermittently, and of course I've hooked up to reproduction Competition Pro joysticks, and it's just amazing. You know, you turn on the TV. Let me see if it, yeah. And I turn on the sound, and I flick on the power switch. Oh, the sound probably was turned on, and if all goes well, the minimig will output something on the screen. Yes. I've changed the default color so it's actually a bit more visible. This basically goes into Commodore 64 compatible mode. You can reset to basic, and then it basically functions as a Commodore 64. As you can see, the the border is a bit offset. That's something that I not necessarily like that much, but it is what it is. I think it's the same border height on the top as it is in the NTSC mode. You can actually put it into an NTSC mode and into a PAL mode. You can, these are reset buttons and all sorts of things, but you can actually do a file browser. I've shown this before, but basically everything that's on the SD card, which is over there, that little blue thing, everything that's on the SD card is actually accessible from all cores. So you can actually browse MSX ROMs and files, but they won't work with the C64 core being active. So if I move to my C64 version, I can actually run cartridge files. I can mount disk images. These are actually my own disks that I transferred. I can run binaries that aren't stored in any file, not in a tape file system or a disk file system. These are just raw binary files, and these are tape images. But if you want to do something else with the little machine, you can by pressing one of the reset buttons. Let me see, over X button. You can load a different core. And I'm actually using an old core, but it still works. It's the Beta 9C. I believe it's all the way up to a Beta 9F now, but I've not had the heart to actually change that around because I'm quite happy how it functions. There's an Amiga emulator that you can use, the minimig, and you can actually you can do that, and you can actually insert floppy disks and all sorts of stuff, disk images and stuff. But yeah, it's great. I mean, it does an Amiga 500 or Amiga 600 to some extent. No Amiga 1200, but I've seen some alpha releases of an Amiga 1200 core, but yeah, this is an older card, so not a lot of software will still be developed for it. VIC-20, actually, that is actually quite cool, because the VIC-20, I also have a Mega Card ROM, a Mega Card game. What is a cartridge, which actually is loaded into the emulator as we are looking at it now. And what it does is actually that it provides this emulated VIC-20 with just about the entire software range of commercially available software titles. And I'm able to just play them on the emulator, or on the emulator, well, on the hardware implementation. It's a re-implementation of the original hardware. So yeah, so it's basically like playing it on a VIC. And yeah, the only thing that actually makes a difference is the fact that you can actually see some debug information, program counters and stuff. And it's still loading in. And now it actually executes the games. Let me see, a familiar game probably. Defender, for example. And that's Defender, and you'll be able to play Defender. Isn't that amazing? Now, that's enough about the that probably will be enough about the minimig, or the Turbo Chameleon 64. But you can imagine that something like this easily replaces well, a lot of the original hardware in a good way. I'm very fascinated by emulators, but also very fascinated by things like this, because this basically does the same thing as the real hardware, but only provides different interfaces. You know, this actually provides VGA out, and it allows you to hook up a semi-modern keyboard. And I just love this faux Dell IBM keyboard, because it really is a very nice keyboard. I don't think it has switches. I think it's a rubber domed keyboard, but still, it's a very nice keyboard, and I really like it. And yeah, as you can see, it just works. And I've yet to check hooking up a real 1541 up to it to see if that actually works. But yeah, I mean, you can do all sorts of file operations on the. Well, the cool thing about and I just want to finally boot up the MSX. Let me see. Does it work? Weird that this doesn't work now. Yeah, it's a bit temperamental. Yeah, now it works. Load core. We open MSX. Now this will try to load the BIOS from SD card, but it just tries to do it too quickly, so I just press a button and then it actually recognizes the SD card, and then it loads the BIOS, and it becomes an MSX 2 Plus with a lot of RAM, and it defaults into a very nice file manager system, which basically is an MS-DOS command line well, MSX-DOS and MS-DOS are very similar, but you can do all sorts of file operations on the entire system using file management systems. Now, like MS-DOS, it has a restriction that it only sees 8 characters. It's a FAT32 or a FAT16 file system, but it doesn't do long file names. So that's the only downside to using this system to actually manipulate your files. But I find it so amazing that in a single small structure, all these computers, all these systems come together and they operate off a single file system. I just find that awesome, you know. If I try to go back and imagine in my brain what it would have been like to have something sitting like this on your desk, have a monitor like this, you know, way back in the 80s, and people coming by and say, oh yeah, this is my computer, it does everything, you know, people would have been blown away. And I think it's good if you're still blown away by what this actually is and how it is all possible, you know. PC Engine, Spectrum, Atari 800, Atari 5200, Commodore 64, MSX, VIC-20, you know, there's a ton of stuff on here, and it just runs, and it's great. Now, if you are trying to go into one of these, you know, try to invest in one of these FPGA systems, you could go for a Turbo Chameleon 64. You could actually stick this in a Commodore 64, like this one, and it will work as a Commodore 64 cartridge, and actually you'll be able to use it as a Commodore 64 cartridge. You'll be able to hook up the VGA to a monitor, and the output of the real Commodore 64 will actually be mimicked by the Turbo Chameleon, and it will output to VGA. So that's actually a way to hook up, this cartridge actually is a way to hook up a VGA monitor to a real C64. But this cartridge has become so much more than just a cartridge, because it has become the C64 itself, and even more than that, you know. I would have loved to see this actually also do the C128, for example. But yeah, interest has waned. I think the last core that came out was perhaps 1 or 2 years ago. So development on the Turbo Chameleon has more or less stalled, but that's also because the system wasn't available. This cartridge wasn't available by individual computers for a long time, and I believe that they're actually issuing a re-release of the system, and that may actually put some more interest back into this system. But there's a ton of other. Oh look, this is a screen. This actually has a screensaver, an MSX screensaver running on the Turbo Chameleon 64, protecting a Samsung screen that just wasn't around when the MSX was. But yeah, if they are going to produce some more of these Turbo Chameleon 64 cartridges, that would actually be awesome, because perhaps it would re-interest a lot of the people into making more cores available, or newer cores available for the system. Because all these FPGA systems, they share a commonality, that is the language that you use to program an FPGA. And where the FPGA, the field programmable grid array, where they differ is in which manners they interface with the exterior. You know, how is input collected? You know, how is that implemented? How is video in and output implemented? And in those parts, these systems differ greatly. And of course also in the FPGA chips themselves, because they are of different complexities. And if you have a very cheap FPGA chip, you can only implement very simple hardware structures. And if you have a very high-end FPGA, you can implement something like an Amiga 1200, or a very complex, oh look at that, there's some fish swimming to the screen, a pixelated fish. I love it. And it's one of the first you know, virtual aquaria. Oh, look at that. But yeah, I find that interesting, and I think it's also a way to preserve our old systems, you know, to have new FPGA systems with, you know, modern hookups. I believe these joystick, 9-pin joystick interfaces, these are actually just serial port connectors. They have the same form factor. Or you can use something like this. Yeah, it's way back down over here. It's a re-implementation of a Commodore 64 motherboard, but it uses the original chips to some extent. And yeah, so you actually use oh look, there's a second fish coming into screen. So you use modern hardware to implement older systems, and it keeps them available. So I'm actually quite a fan of this FPGA like things. But what I'm not a fan of, at the same time I am, is the fact that you just have this spaghetti mess. I mean, this doesn't look tidy at all, but it does look a lot nicer now that it is encased a bit more. And you can put it behind the TV, but you will have to have access to the buttons, to the reset buttons, and you know, the LEDs and stuff, so you can see what is going on. I would love to get one of these newer systems that is better supported, but I don't know where to begin. I would love to have a system that does my Amiga 1200, so I can actually transport my ailing Amiga 1200 stuff onto one of these, and just have that as a functioning system, and try to save my Amiga by replacing the caps and working on it. So yeah, this is just me rambling on about my FPGAs and stuff. Yeah, I just have some time on my hand, and it's a very gray day, so I thought, let's show you some of the stuff that keeps me occupied and keeps me busy. So yeah. Okay, Mark signing off, and I'll be back with another video soon.